What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the garage. Today we're going to take a look at this machine that I've got sitting in front of me, and that is the Vevor TIG 155A. And for the sake of transparency, I'm going to let you know that Vevor did send this to me for the purposes of a review and video. However, as always, all of my thoughts and opinions in this video are my own and unbiased. So first we're going to go over some of the specs of the machine, then we'll look at what it comes with, go over pricing, who it's for, and then we'll get into some welding. All right, so this Vevor TIG 155A is a 110 volt only DC TIG welder with a maximum output of 155 amps. So first things first, with this being a 110 only machine, if you're running this on a 30 amp circuit, you will not be able to put this to its full power setting more than likely. You're not going to get 155 amps out of here. It's going to trip your breaker. That's not a fault of the welder. That is just your circuitry in your house cannot provide enough power to run this at its full potential. And I see a lot of comments in things of people getting welders, tripping breakers, sending them back and trying to find one that won't trip their breaker. They're not going to, because it's not a fault of the machine that they're using. It's just plugged into a circuit that cannot provide enough power, and it gets overloaded and trips the breaker. So with that out of the way, let's talk about some of the other features of this machine. It does have the automatic gas valve built into the machine. It has high frequency start, and that is provided via this switch on the TIG torch itself. There is no foot pedal, and this does not control any amperage. This is just an on-off. This will, in fact, stick weld. It has an option for that, and it also has settings for pre-flow and post-flow on TIG welding, which is a nice feature. The machine weighs in at about 5 or 6 pounds. It's not very heavy. And right now, as of filming, it is $129. Normally it looked like it was about $160. So currently $129. Normally, according to Amazon's regular price or list price, it is $160. So not a bad price for a TIG machine, considering what is included with it. And we'll get into that here in just a second. So now I want to bring you up in close, kind of show you the front of this thing, show you what it comes with, and we'll go from there. All right, so in the box, and I didn't do an unboxing, I've already unboxed it. I don't necessarily like unboxing, so we're not doing unboxings on this channel. You get your TIG lead, comes with a nice denim cover on it. I was actually very impressed by the cover that is on this lead. The torch itself is not bad. It is pretty hefty, and it does come with a couple caps we'll see here in a second. But this is the switch, just on and off. You can reposition this a little bit because it's zip tied on, which is pretty common when it comes to these types of switches. And then of course you've got your gas inlet / electrical connector, 2-in-1 there. And then you've got your plug for the high frequency start on the switch. You get a ground clamp, pretty standard for a machine like this. Nothing really wrong with it. Could be nicer, but for the price of the machine, it's fine. You also get a length of braided hose. Seems pretty sturdy. One thing I will say is that I know this is a lower end, cheaper machine, budget-friendly machine. I would like to see threaded hoses, just because when you start introducing hose barbs into a gas system, you have just more places for leaks. You've got basically at every connection, there's actually 2 connections, because you've got the barb and then you've got the hose on the barb. So I'd like to see this at least have threaded connectors, but with the price of the machine, it will work just fine. And then it comes with this pouch, and this TIG lead was in this pouch out of the box. Now I have the owner's manual and just the other loose accessories with it. So you do get an owner's manual here. And it's pretty decent. It's very typical of a machine like this. This is your extra back cap, full length for the tungsten, if you don't want to cut your tungsten down. You do get a few more gas cups. They appear to all be of the same size as what's already installed. And that's pretty small. Looks like maybe a 3 or a 4, I would guess. You do get a couple extra collets, and these are different sizes in case you want to change out the size of the tungsten. However, they do also give you a single piece of tungsten, which is actually nice because a lot of these machines don't come with any consumables. So getting a piece of tungsten so you can use this out of the box as long as you have your gas setup is very nice, because people often forget or may not realize they need to order that separately. So it comes with a pair of these, and at first I thought it was just a TIG torch holder. However, I believe when you install these on the top of the machine, it is actually a place to wrap your lead around when not in use. And that's a nice touch. I'm not going to install it on this machine just because I have a TIG torch holder on the side of my table, and everything kind of stays in one spot here, and I can just kind of coil it up. But that is included with the screws needed to install those. So now let's take a look at the front of the machine here. I'm going to turn it on. The fan's going to kick on, so I apologize, but there's really no way around it. So interestingly enough, when you turn this machine on, it kind of has a default setting. It's going to come up in MMA or stick mode at 120 amps. This button here is what's going to switch you through functions. There's a clean function on here, and I'm not quite sure what that does yet. We'll take a look at that. And then that's your TIG function here. Now you can see that this lights up because this is the line for your TIG settings. And if you press this button, right now it's on weld at 100 amps. But this is your pre-flow, and you can turn the knob. This is your amperage setting. And then this is your post-flow in seconds. So you can go from you can go from 1 up to 10 on the post-flow. And the pre-flow is 0 up to 1 second. And of course your amperage is 10 to 155. Now this knob, remember I said this was a button. So you can tell right now it's at, we'll set it to 100 amps here. If you hold this button down and then turn it, it will go up in 10 amp increments. When you let go, you're back into single digit increments. And that works on the other settings as well. It'll go up by 1 whole second when you hold it down on the post flow, and then tenths of a second without holding it down. And your pre-flow is the same. But because it only has 0 to 1, it just jumps from 0 to 1. You've got 2T and 4T, so one of those is going to mean you have to hold down the switch the whole time you're welding. The other one is going to be, you can tap the switch, it'll come on, tap the switch, and it'll come off. And I typically use it where I need to hold it down, especially with TIG welding. I'm not doing anything very large. And with this machine, honestly, and the duty cycle that it has, you're probably not going to necessarily need that feature, but it's there if you do. The duty cycle of this machine, while we're talking about that, is 30%. So at a full 155 amps, you'll be able to weld for 3 minutes out of a 10-minute period. That's not 3 continuous minutes. That's 3 minutes total out of 10 is how a duty cycle works. And then of course down here you've got your different connections, positive, negative, your switch, and then your TIG lead goes here. That's really about it for the front. The back, there's nothing special. I'll turn it around here so we can see it. Up here you've got your power switch, which is actually a very nice switch. It sticks out a little bit further and is a little bit easier to do, especially with a gloved hand, than some other units. You got your gas barb here. This is a grounding screw if you wanted to ground this externally. Once again, barbed fittings on this for gas, so keep that in mind. Not a big deal on the back of this machine. I don't like using the barbs on the regulator setup. So I just want to stress, when you're purchasing a regulator for this machine specifically, you need to make sure that it comes with one of these barbed fittings here, because these threads on these regulators are not necessarily an easy thread size to find at a hardware store. So it's a lot easier if it comes with some kind of barbed connector. I'm lucky enough that mine I still had floating around and I'm able to use it here. So I got the machine hooked up, and I think the most used case for a machine like this at this price point is going to kind of be like a scrap metal art sort of thing, where maybe you don't want to use a bunch of filler metal or have a bunch of slag left over and that you need to clean up, because on scrap metal art, a lot of times it's hard to get into places to clean off any slag or, you know, residue from flux and spatter. So with a machine like this, my thought is that this would be a good entry level machine for scrap metal art and other things like that. So what I'm going to use is just some washers, some standard, you know, flat washers, and we're going to weld those together and just see how it does. Because this is TIG, you can also braze with this with silicon bronze rods. You can do stainless with it, and that's all sort of things you would want to use in those scenarios. So that's what we're going to do. I know it's not terribly exciting, but it is a good application and test to see just how it works. I do have a clamp-on multimeter that I got for Christmas, so we are going to see if this is actually putting out what it says it is or how close it is. It's probably not going to be dead on. We'll see how close it is, and I will post, or we'll talk about those in a little bit here, but let me get this thing kind of dialed in. I may have to adjust gas, and then I will bring this camera up closer so you can see the welds. I just want to run kind of a straight line bead on this 1/4 inch plate. This really isn't going to be enough for 1/4 inch welding, but I got it set at about 94 amps and we'll just see what happens. Now what I want to do, and I don't recommend anybody do this, but I'm going to just kind of weld without looking so I can look at that amperage reading on the multimeter at a couple different settings. I tried doing it, but I forgot what the settings were already. So I'm going to do that. Like I said, don't recommend you doing it, but definitely important not to look at the weld. I can't see the screen through the lens on the welding hood. So this first test is going to be at 30 amps. I just got about 36.97 on that. Now I'm going to move it up to 40. It's got about 47.8, so call it 48 amps at 40 on the machine. So at 50 amps, we just hit a clear 60.16. Now I've jumped up to 80 amps on the machine. We'll see what that reads. Sometimes with these machines, when you start getting into a sweet spot, they're a lot more accurate than the lower high end. So we'll see what it does at about 80 amps. So I'm still hitting about 90 to 91 amps with the machine set at 80. So this seems to be running almost a consistently 10 amps higher than what the machine's readout shows. Now here's 90. I hit 97 amps there with 90 on the machine. So here comes 100 amps, and I'm going to stop it here because the machine's already running higher than what the readout is showing, and I am only on a 30 amp breaker, so I don't want to push it too far and end up tripping the breaker if I can avoid it. So again, 100 amps, we'll see what this shows. $100 amps, I just hit 110.4. So I shut the machine down. I'm going to let this plate cool for a minute. We'll take an up close look at the welds themselves, but I want to talk about that readout we were just getting. So I just got this for Christmas. Haven't had a chance to use it yet on a welding review, but that's kind of why I got this style. And I just wanted to start checking these machines. I need to go back and check everything that I've done a video on so far that I have here in the shop. So as you guys just saw, this machine's putting out about 10 more amps consistently throughout the whole range than what the readout is showing. And there could be a slight variance on the multimeter itself, but it's not going to be enough to account for that 10 amps across the range. So keep that in mind. With these welders, it is very important for you to use the machine, get used to it, and then come up with your own welding chart, because a pre-made chart is going to be counting either somebody else's machine or some standard operating, 40 amps is 40 amps, but on this machine, 40 amps is actually putting out closer to 50, or 100 amps is putting out closer to 110. And that can make a big difference. I started out at 60 amps on here, and I know it was too hot because I was burning straight through these washers. So I had to go dial this machine down all the way to like 30 and weld like that. And then over here, when I was welding directly to this 1/4 inch plate, I did bump it up to about 90 or so just to get a nice puddle going and use some filler rod. But that just goes to show that it is always beneficial to make your own welding charts that are specific to your machine as you use them and get used to them. So we'll let this plate cool off a little bit, and we'll come back and take a look at these welds up close. So while this plate's cooling off, before we take a look at these welds, let's talk about my thoughts on the welder itself and then who I think this would be a good fit for. So the first thing I want to talk about is obviously what we just saw was the amperage difference between the display on the machine and the multimeter. That was about 10 amps across the range that I tested. So about 30 amps up through 100 amps. I did skip a couple 10 amp increments in there for the sake of the video, but it was about 10 amps off throughout that entire range. There was no sweet spot where it kind of leveled out and steadied out and was more accurate. It just was a consistent 10 amps, give or take, off throughout the range. That's okay as long as you recognize that that's the case, because you can adjust for that. But to really figure that out, you need a multimeter that can detect amperage through like the clamp-on style. And not everybody has one of those. So other than that, you'd have to do it by look and feel of the welds and the thickness of the material, which can be a challenge for a beginner. It's still a challenge for me sometimes, but that being said, if you develop your own chart for this machine, you can really work around it and it's not a big deal. The second thing I noticed was, I don't know if you guys, someone's probably going to yell at me for this in the comments, but I know when I'm using a TIG welder, typically I have this like kind of going around my back and down my arm, because that way I don't have this trying to be pulled out of my hand. It's just more comfortable to me. There's probably some reason I shouldn't do that, but I did notice using this lead got pretty warm. My other lead on my Yes Welder machine does not do that, and I've used that pretty extensively, just like I'm demonstrating here. So I don't know if this could stand to be a little bit thicker wire through here. A larger gauge wire would help that, but it did get warm and I did notice it. And that was more so when I got up into higher amperages like 80, 90, 100. So a couple minor things I'd like to see, but keeping in mind that this is a budget machine, it is not a deal breaker by any means. I would like to see it include an electrode holder for stick welding, just because it has that as an option, and it would give you two options to weld. Or you could buy this machine and stick weld until you could afford your argon setup, or anything along those lines. It's just more options is not necessarily a bad thing, especially out of the box. So I'd like to see that included. They're not that expensive, but it could add a couple dollars to the machine. Another thing is, instead of including 3 of the same gas cups, I'd like to see 3 different sizes. It's going to give you more options. All 3 of these that come with the machine are the same, and they're pretty small. So if you're trying to do anything a bit larger, it's going to be more time consuming, because you're going to have to probably do more than one pass. But not a deal breaker, because these gas cups are relatively cheap once again. I would more so like to see different gas cups included, because they include different size collets. So you can run bigger tungsten out of the box if you were to purchase some. You just don't have options when it comes to gas cups. This TIG torch is not horrible. I mean, it's very basic. It's not a flex head or anything. It's fixed. And the switch you can move around to kind of get comfortable. I tried moving it around a little bit. I'm just not used to using a finger switch because I use a foot pedal a lot. But it wasn't bad to get used to, and I could see where this would be really handy in out of position welds. Basically, if you're trying to do scrap metal art and you need to reach up high on something and weld, you can without having to mess around with a foot pedal. So I like that it's high frequency start. That makes it a little easier for a beginner TIG welder. You don't have lift or scratch start. You can just hold the button down when you're close and away you go. It's a lot less frustrating to learn that. And that worked very reliably, honestly. Just as reliable as my other TIG welder. So not a whole lot to really complain about. This machine isn't designed to weld big stuff. It's a 110 TIG welder. So you're not going to be welding some 1/2 inch plate with this thing. So more hobby around the house projects, or like I said, scrap metal art projects, this would be a really nice unit for, because typically there you're doing smaller, more delicate welds to kind of hold different pieces together. That's why I kind of picked out the washers to do with this, is because that's a similar application to something you would do in scrap metal art. And it works well for that. These washers don't look that great because I burned through them because the machine was set too high, but the actual welds I did turn out pretty decent actually. So let me grab the camera and we'll come up here and look at these welds. So up here you can kind of see where I blew through these at first because the machine was just set too high. Once I dialed it back, we started getting nicer tacks between these, and it handled that just fine. Now, these spots are all where I was testing amperage, so we can kind of ignore those. I mean, as you can see, it laid a pretty decent bead, as well as this one. And then this was my fault here. There was a start and a stop here that I did not do a good job at, but it also did just fine adding a regular amount of filler metal. As I said, this one is a little gray, might have been a little too hot, but it would still hold and be a perfectly serviceable weld. So that was the Vevor TIG 155A, and I hope this video helped you decide if you wanted to look into this machine further. Linked in the description below. Also, check out some other videos. I've got some great beginner welding videos as well as some others. We do a live stream every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. So come hang out with us over there. We are always talking shop, great group of people. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this and some other future projects I've got lined up.